Once you've deployed your database to a remote server, you can configure your Dreamweaver site so that when it's running locally, it's talking to the local database, and when it's working on the remote site, it's working with the remote database. To do this, you'll have to make some customizations to your connections file. In my website, it's called explorecalifornia.php, and these files are always located in the connections folder under the site root. In the connections file, there are 4 variables being set: the host name, the database name, the username, and the password. These settings currently are for the local database. Using a little bit of PHP conditional code, you can detect where you're running and set the variables accordingly. I'll start in this demonstration by doing a little bit of debugging and showing you some values that you can inspect to find out where you're running. I'll use an echo command and I'll output 2 values concatenated together. The first is $_server HTTP host. This returns the name of the domain that's accepting and processing the request. Then I'll put in a dot for concatenation, and then I'll output $_server bracket request_URI. This is the full name of the page, as it's known to the browser. Now I'll save the changes and run the page in the browser, and show you that it returns the name of the domain, in this case localhost, and then the full URI, or Uniform Resource Identifier. That includes all of the folders and the file name that's being requested. In this case, my local server is running in the folder DW with PHP. Now let's see what happens when I'm working on the remote server. I'll go back to Dreamweaver, and I'll go to the Files panel to the Connections folder, and I'll put this file onto my server. Then I'll go back to the browser, and I'll replace the name of the folder that I'm using as my local server with the name of the folder I'm using as the remote server, remote. And I'll see that the same file returns a value of remote. So for this demonstration, I'm going to look for the word remote, and if I find it, I'll determine that I'm on a remote server. When you're working with an actual remote site, look for your domain name or your IP address, because if that value is a part of this string, that tells you you're working on the remote site. Here's the PHP code I'll use to do the detection. I'll change this line of code so that instead of echoing this value, I'll save this value as a variable. I'll call it request URI. Then I'll create a variable called POS, standing for position. And I'll get the value of that variable by calling a function called strPOS. The strPOS function looks for a substring within a string. In the syntax example, you'll see that PHP refers to this as finding a needle in a haystack. So the first value I'll pass in is the haystack, my variable request URI. And then the second value I'll pass in is remote. And again, if you're working with an actual remote site, it might be mycompany.com, the domain name. The strPOS function returns the numeric position of the string that it finds. Or if it doesn't find anything, it returns a blank value. You can determine whether the string was found in the request URI by asking whether the POS variable returns true or false. So I'm going to add an if clause. I'll create the if statement with a pair of parentheses, and an else statement also with a pair of parentheses. Then I'll take the 4 variables that are being set, I'll cut them to the clipboard, and I'll paste them twice into both the if clause and into the else clause. Now I'll apply a condition. For the if clause, I'll place the cursor between the parentheses, and I'll simply type in the name of the variable, POS. This expression will return true if the value was found, and false if it wasn't. So the first condition is for the remote site, not for the local. And I'm going to change the name of the database from Explore California to Explore Remote. And again, if you're working on an actual remote site, you would change all of these values: the host name, the database name, the username, and the password. In my case, all of the values are the same except for the database itself. I'll save my changes, and I'll go to my site header, and I'll synchronize. This time, I'm going to click the Synchronize button in the toolbar, just to show you that that's an available workflow. I'll preview files that need to be put onto the remote server, and I'll see that my connections file is eligible. I'll click OK, and that places the new version of the file on the remote server. Now, I'm going to open the file in the Explorers folder, explorerlist.php. You may remember that the difference that I created between the local database and the remote database is that I removed all of the data from the Explorers table. So I'll open explorerlist.php, and I'll run it in the browser. So right now, I'm looking at the login form for the local site. I'll log in with the username Explorer1 and the password, which is simply password. And when I look at the version of the list page on the local site, I see all of the data. Now I'll go to the web address in the browser, and I'll change from the local site, DW with PHP, to the remote site in the remote folder. If you're prompted to log in again, do so. But then you should see the version of the page on the remote site that shows that there's nothing in the database. That is, that the Explorers table is empty. And that verifies that you're looking at the version of the database that's targeted for the remote site. When you customize your connections file, you should be aware that it may cause some problems for Dreamweaver. For example, if I now go to the Databases panel and refresh, depending on the state of your setup, you may or may not be able to see the list of tables, and you may or may not be able to add new server behaviors. If you have any trouble with this, I recommend keeping a couple of different copies of your connections file around, and just rename them as needed when you're doing your development work. In this case, all of my development work is complete, and I'm simply deploying my finished PHP site to my remote server. And if I need to make any bug fixes or add simple features to the site later on, I'll be able to easily do so using this connections file that's been customized to work with both the local and the remote database.